Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's fourth episode in our summer series, you will hear from presenters at our conference, Menzies and the British Commonwealth of Nations. The first presenters will be Selwyn Cornish and John Hawkins on Menzies, Keynes and the Australian economists. The second presentation will be from Mark Lunney on A Judicial Commonwealth. And the third and final presentation in this episode will be from Eli Rubenstein Sturgess on Equally Sacred Precincts, Why Lords was as central as Westminster to Menzies' relationship with the British Commonwealth of Nations.
Our paper focuses on Menzies' association or friendship with a number of prominent Australian economists and his meeting in London in 1941 with John Maynard Keynes, the distinguished British economist who many economists would argue was the greatest economist of the 20th century. We spend some time in the paper asking why Menzies formed a close association with the economists and why he especially wanted to meet Keynes. Menzies' biographers and others who knew him well have generally suggested that Menzies expressed little interest in economics, preferring instead to leave economic issues for others to handle. Alan Martin, for example, claimed that Menzies, quote, was not well read in economics and, like most of his associates, knew and understood little about the ideas of economists like Keynes. Cameron Hazelhurst, in his book on Menzies, wrote that, quote, it is undeniable that Menzies seemed comparatively ill at ease with economic issues. He leaned heavily on advice from public servants and a select group of business and financial magnates. Dr. H.C. Coombs recalled that when Menzies regained the prime ministership in 1949, his, and I'm quoting Coombs, Menzies' understanding of economics matters was not, especially at this time, profound. It seems that Menzies sought the company of economists not only because he wanted to sound them out on matters of economic policy, but also because he enjoyed their company. Sir John Bunting, the Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, wrote in his book, R.G. Menzies, A Portrait, that Menzies often referred to the group of distinguished public servants upon whom he relied for his advice as his boys. The boys, according to Bunting, quote, were very much companions, especially if you got to know them well. He enjoyed their company as much as he appreciated their official ministrations. All the economists that we mention in our paper were public servants for at least part of their careers when Menzies was Prime Minister. John will talk in a moment about Menzies and the Australian economists that he particularly Menzies associated with. I'll start off with some brief words about the meeting Menzies had with Keynes in London in March 1941. When Menzies was planning his visit to London in 1938, and Menzies made 4 trips to London and other places from 1935 to 1941. His first trip overseas was in 1935. He went again in 1936, yet again in 1938, and in 1941. But when he was planning his visit to London in 1938, Douglas Copeland, the Professor of Commerce and Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Commerce at the University of Melbourne, who knew Menzies and Keynes well, wrote to Keynes to let him know that Menzies was coming to London and wanted to meet him. Copeland informed Keynes that Menzies, quote, would particularly like to have the opportunity of talking with you, adding, and I quote again from the letter that Copeland sent to Keynes, Copeland said, Menzies is probably the ablest man in federal politics today. He is still young and is going through some reorientation of some of his ideas on economic policy. However, Menzies and Keynes were unable to meet in 1938, possibly because Keynes was still recovering from a major heart problem that he'd experienced in the previous year. But in March 1941, they met at a dinner in London, which had been arranged for Menzies. Copeland wrote to Keynes in February 1941 to let him know that Menzies, now the Australian Prime Minister, was about to visit London again, and, to quote Copeland, before he left Australia, he expressed a desire to meet you. Copeland mentioned that Keynes, quote, had no doubt heard that Menzies has perhaps more faith in economists than is good for any responsible political leader. More seriously, Copeland thought that Keynes would find Menzies, and I'm quoting again, would find Menzies a most charming and intellectual companion if you should have the opportunity for a leisurely talk with him. The diary that Menzies kept of his overseas visit in 1941, an edited version of which was published by the National Library of Australia in 1991, records that Menzies met Keynes in London on Wednesday, the 12th of March, 1941. The diary entry is brief, stating that Menzies, quote, dined at Savoy as a guest of Lord Nathan, who produces J.M. Keynes, as if he's produced out of thin air. Menzies noted in the diary that he had, quote, a long talk with Keynes, who admires Copeland and Gibbon. The diary records that Menzies spoke at the dinner on the economic and munitions effort in Australia, and no doubt these were subjects that Menzies wanted to discuss with Keynes, who'd published several newspaper articles on war finance and was again advising the British Treasury, as he had done during the First World War. In a letter written to Copeland after the meeting in London, Keynes said that, and I quote, I have already met your Prime Minister. He made a great impression on me, and so I find he has on most people here. He speaks extraordinarily well, seems a capable politician, and above all, is on top of his job and serious about what matters. I had quite a good talk with him and quickly realised how much he depends on you and other economists. Keynes added that he hoped that he may, I'm quoting Keynes, he may get some opportunity of seeing Mr. Menzies again before he goes back. We certainly have very few ministers who are as much up to their jobs as he is to his. While it was Menzies who initially sought a meeting with Keynes, it was Keynes who later expressed an interest in wanting to meet Menzies again. And I'll just quote that final sentence in Keynes's letter to Copeland after the meeting between Keynes and Menzies. Keynes said, "We certainly have very few ministers who are so much up to their jobs as he is to his." And as I say, while it was Menzies who initially sought a meeting with Keynes, it was Keynes who later expressed an interest in wanting to meet Menzies again. But there is no indication in Menzies' diary or elsewhere that the two men met on another occasion. Keynes died on Easter Day 1946, having never visited Australia, and Menzies' next visit to London was in 1948 after Keynes had died, so clearly they didn't meet again. But it would appear, and we don't have a great deal of information, but it would appear in that conversation that Menzies had with Keynes that most of Menzies' interest in wanting to meet Keynes was to talk about the war effort and the financing of the war. Keynes seemed to be well up to date with what was happening in Australia. Australia had reached or was very close to reaching full employment. And if it was going to continue to commit more funds, resources to the war effort, then quite clearly what would have to happen would be that there would have to be a cutback in the use of resources in other activities, including consumption and infrastructure, housing, and so on. And that seemed to be the main basis of the conversation.
So Menzies assumed that public servants would faithfully serve governments. If they felt unable to do that, they would resign. But if they stayed in their posts, they would recognise the mandate of the government and serve them to the best of their abilities. In the case of Coombs, Menzies had a good word for him from Menzies' own brother, but also importantly, Menzies spoke to Chifley, and Chifley assured him that Coombs was a person not only of great ability, but of great integrity, and assured him that he would serve him loyally and well. And Menzies accepted that, and they got on extremely well. And indeed, I think it's a tribute to and reflects very well on both men, the fact that they were, despite political differences, they were able to work together and effectively in the public interest. And the relationship developed and deepened over time, and they actually became very good friends. So you have this very moving tribute that Menzies made when Coombs retired about how he felt that Coombs not just had a lot of ability, but that he valued the friendship they had. And he ends the letter by saying, "I salute one of the greatest Australians." So another public servants, as Selwyn said, Menzies referred to as his boys. And so these were four of the most prominent Australian economists of the 20th century. So Douglas, only going to be able to sketch very briefly their CVs, but Douglas Copeland was a founder of the Economic Society of Australia, the Economic Record, the Australian Conference of Economists. He was an academic and many other things. In 1941, he became Menzies' economic consultant. They got on very well, although relations cooled a bit when Copeland developed political ambitions and told Menzies, "Look, I think I'm going to run for Parliament, and would you appoint me as Treasurer?" And Menzies sort of said, "I think, dear boy, you're getting a bit ahead of yourself there. That's the job for somebody with a lot more experience." And Copeland sort of was a little bit offended by that attitude. But they sort of patched things up. Trevor Swan, probably the Australian that's come closest to winning an economics Nobel Prize. The Solo Swan model won an economics Nobel Prize for Solo, but not for Swan. He also worked as a chief economist in the Department of Post-War Reconstruction. and later was in the Prime Minister's department, then left to become a professor of economics. Roland Wilson, he was Secretary of the Treasury from 1951 to 1966, so most of the time that Menzies was Prime Minister, and Leslie Melville, Vice Chancellor of the ANU. So very distinguished, most of them working in Canberra and therefore able to meet with Menzies, not just in a formal work setting, but informally. All of them would drop around to the lodge, or Menzies would go and meet with them at ANU. They all have at least some connection with Britain, too, given the topic of today's conference. So Douglas Copeland gave the first Alfred Marshall lectures at the University of Cambridge, and Trevor Swan gave a later series of lectures. Swan also worked briefly in the UK Cabinet Office. Roland Wilson was a Rhodes Scholar, so he got a PhD from Oxford, but not content with that, he got a second PhD in the United States. And both Douglas Copeland and Leslie Melville attended the famous World Economic Conference in 1933 in London. So, working on with the advice of these economists, they weren't quite as Keynesian, perhaps, as Nugget Coombs. Indeed, Nugget Coombs was probably as Keynesian as it's possible to be. In Coombs' autobiography, Child Balance, he starts the book by what he describes as the pivotal event in his life, which was the publication of Keynes' general theory. But these others were also broadly Keynesian, and they helped support and persuade Menzies in an economic policy that was essentially Keynesian in the whole time he was Prime Minister. Now, views would differ about how deftly the Keynesian approach was adopted. So, for example, Keynesian policies were used during the Korean War boom to try to cool the economy, which was overheating. Inflation had got to around 20%. But unfortunately, by the time the policies were put in place to try to cool the economy, wool prices had already started dropping, and so it probably made the recession worse. And there was sort of criticism during the 1950s and 60s about so-called stop-go policies. On the other hand, the 1950s and 1960s were the period of the strongest economic growth Australia has ever seen, and unemployment rates averaging somewhere around, I think, under 2%, and other than the Korean War boom, low inflation. So it's hard to be too critical of the economic record of that period. So I hope we've sort of demonstrated that one of the conventional wisdoms about Menzies is maybe not quite right. He did seem to have much more of an interest in economics, and he certainly had closer relationship with economists than is generally held to be the case.
This symposium is about Robert Menzies, and by necessity, I'll say something about him. I'm much less qualified to speak about than others who are presenting at the symposium who are more familiar with his political career than I am. We all know Menzies was a lawyer and deeply proud of it, but he long since practiced or ceased practicing by the time of the changing political commonwealth that formed the theme of the symposium. So while I'll start with Menzies, the primary focus of what I'll say this morning, is how the changing commonwealth that he identified challenged any idea of law at the heart of the new commonwealth. In simple terms, Menzies drew a distinction between the old British Commonwealth, represented by its members' common link of loyalty and duty to the Crown, and the new Commonwealth, which ceased to have that common link once India became a republic in 1949 and remained within the Commonwealth. Law was a constituent element of the bond between members of the British Commonwealth. In his letters to the Times in 1956 on the changing Commonwealth, Menzies refers to law 3 times. The first is in a rather defensive response to criticism of the process of colonisation, where he refers to the supremacy of law as one of the great and peculiar British elements that made an inspiring record. The second was when he wistfully queried whether the formalisation of Dominion status in the Balfour Declaration of 1926 was wise. Quote, "The whole historical genius of our race is against it. The draftsmen of the Code Napoleon were intellectually at the polls from the creators of the English common law." The common law was again at the heart of the British Commonwealth. Finally, When describing what bound the members of the British Commonwealth, he referred back to the Crown, our relation to it, our high feelings about it, its legal significance going so far beyond the mere techniques of the law, which gave its special character to the British Commonwealth, which Balfour and his associates set out to define 30 years ago. Note that law is relevant in two ways: the techniques of the law, its processes and rules, but also something more innate than in its formal manifestations. It was for Menzies a critical part of the zeitgeist of the British Commonwealth. In the written paper, I traced the increasing challenges Menzies faced in using rule of law as the basis of Commonwealth unity, ending increasingly in an unwillingness to talk about it, because only on an emasculated version could it be said to apply across the Commonwealth. But there were other, more tangible ways in which the Commonwealth might show legal unity. One was the holding of Commonwealth and Empire law conferences. The first, held in London in 1955, brought a variety of solicitors, barristers, judges, and academics together to share and discuss papers on a variety of legal topics from a professional viewpoint. From a distance, the distinction between the constitutional concerns relating to the rule of law among the members of the Commonwealth, on which there was clearly no unity, and the professional commitment to rule of law values, which was common to members, was a very fine one. At the second Commonwealth and Empire Law Conference in Ottawa in 1960, these tensions were becoming clear. While the immediate problem was solved by South Africa's failure to renew an application for Commonwealth membership after it became a republic in 1961, the wider challenge remained. Framing the legal unity of the Commonwealth around the rule of law was fraught, a fact of which Menzies was well aware when he gave his report on the London meeting of the Commonwealth Prime Ministers Conference in 1964 to the Federal Parliament later that year. The third Commonwealth and Empire Law Conference took place in Sydney at the end of August 1965. Not only had South Africa left the Commonwealth by then, but in 1963, the relationship between Australian and English courts had undergone an important change. During the Second World War, the High Court of Australia had twice held that it would decline to follow one of its own earlier decisions if there was a later decision of an English Superior Court that was inconsistent with it. Of the English courts, it was only the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council that formally bound the High Court. This self-restraint, which only partly reflected earlier rulings, was always under pressure. And in May 1963, a unanimous High Court in Parker and the Crown declared that they would no longer consider themselves bound by the decisions of English courts other than the Privy Council. Conversely, at a Commonwealth level, long-standing suggestions of some sort of Commonwealth Court of Appeal began reappearing. The timing was expressly linked to the upcoming Commonwealth and Empire Law Conference in Sydney, as both the previous and current British governments had decided that the conference was the best place to test the water and whether there was any support for the introduction of such a measure. The Sydney Conference was opened at the end of August of 1965 by the President of the Law Council of Australia, one John Kerr. The nature of the meeting was made clear. Matters of policy with which governments deal and in which differences emerged, some of them basic, were matters with which, quote, we are not concerned. To avoid any doubt, Kerr went on, we are here as individual lawyers to talk professional and legal business, and it follows quite clearly that no one at our gathering, sitting here and deliberating, has to be taken as agreeing or disagreeing with any matter of policy of any kind whatsoever. We are not here to talk politics. Even without politics, however, the Commonwealth Court of Appeal attracted little support at the conference. While Singapore and Malaysia were in favour, the final plenary session, the Canadian representative, Justice Martland of the Supreme Court of Canada, made it clear that Canada would not accept an appeal from its own highest court to the new Commonwealth Court. And Gerald Gardner, the English Lord Chancellor, admitted in his final report to the final plenary session that the larger countries of the Commonwealth, including the white settler colonies, did not want it. Indeed, in a letter to High Court Justice Sir Victor Windeyer from the Australian High Commission in London, written 6 weeks after the conference, Sir Alexander Downer told Windeyer that he'd warned Gardner before he left that he did not think his horse would gallop. He noted when it was raised at the Commonwealth Prime Ministers Conference in June 1965, it met with no support from ourselves, and open hostility by India. Downer's assessment that he doubted whether much more will come of it was accurate, and this oft-cited idea effectively disappeared after the Sydney Conference. So what was left then for a possible common legal basis of the Commonwealth? The Sydney Conference was also the death of any idea of a Commonwealth, a common law, or Commonwealth series of judge-made law. An Australian delegate, the young Roma Mitchell, neutrally expressed her view that there was no indication that a Commonwealth common law based on judgments in one jurisdiction, being binding on courts of another, was or should be developed. More powerfully, an Indian delegate thought it practically impossible because the underlying conditions for the creation of a Commonwealth common law were not present. Starting with the relatively tame observation that the Commonwealth as it stood today, quote, is a rather loose assemblage of nations at differing degrees of economic, social, literary and political development, he finished in less equivocal terms. The Commonwealth today is neither predominantly or politically viable, nor has homogeneity or near homogeneity of culture and values. He even doubted whether some common modes of legal proceedings in common law systems, such as the adversarial system or rules of evidence, might be suitable for societies which had indigenous traditions of dispute resolution operating in different forms. Implicit in the paper is a sense that, whatever might be the case for the old British Commonwealth, there could be no common Commonwealth law in the post-war period of decolonisation and independence. Despite these protestations against formal unity of law, whether in the notions of the rule of law or in more concrete substantive rules of law, what is striking to the modern reader is the frequent reference to a shared common law, heritage or spirit. At the Sydney Conference, the same speakers that recognised the undesirability or impossibility of a formal Commonwealth common law also recognised the value of persuasive precedent of decisions from courts of members of the Commonwealth among themselves. While this did not set up a system of a common law, the practice, quote, fertilises the juristic literature of the countries and helps the development of a common jurisprudence or legal theory. It was this more abstract notion of unity that was explored in a contemporary article by High Court Justice Sir Victor Windeyer in 1966. Windeyer was primarily addressing the narrower issue of how the formerly hierarchical legal relationship between England and Australia, what I have elsewhere called the legalism of imperialism, would operate in a world where the House of Lords had just declared judicial independence from the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords. As membership of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council and the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords largely overlapped, there was a potential risk that the High Court of Australia would decline to follow a decision of the House of Lords, only for that decision to be appealed to the Judicial Committee, staffed by the same judges with whom the High Court had just disagreed. A brilliant historian and author of a text on a legal history, and of course well known to Menzies, Windeyer was well placed to sketch out a meaning of common law heritage in the post-imperial world. His first step was to emphasise continuity rather than change. The common law had never been uniform at the level of substance, both either through case law and since the Colonial Laws of Liberty Act 1865 at the latest, by statute, because the self-governing colonies had a wide discretion with which to modify the common law and that which applied in England. Second, he reassessed the imperial legal legacy for a post-colonial world. What we call the common law of England is not the law of the land, but the law of a people, the British peoples. For Scotsmen perforce must accept it when they are overseas. It is not the law of a place, but the customs of our race. It is part of the civilization and culture that is ours. Viewed in this way, there was no need, indeed it was undesirable, to have a common substantive, a common law across the jurisdictions of the old empire. The law was not, quote, a number of specific legacies to be selected for us from time to time by courts in England. Rather, it is a share in a general legacy of method and spirit, of doctrine rather than dogma, of general principle rather than particular rules. In short, a system of law. We must not only accept our inheritance, we must use it. While Windeyer addressed some of the issues raised by speakers from the newly independent nations at the Sydney Conference, the need to accommodate liberty with national solidarity, he, whether intentionally or not, provided a reason why the common law could be a shared resource of unity amongst the new Commonwealth. We, as in Australia, can emphasise that we accept the common law of England from choice, that it is for us a living body of great principles that can stand where particular rules are altered to meet the needs of men in a particular place. And to work out what the specific legal rules were in cases of doubt, the corpus juris to which we looked in Australia was obviously Australian courts first, but also to courts of other common law jurisdictions, the kind of fertilisation referred to by the Indian delegate at the Sydney conference. Some structural changes made the development of a judicial commonwealth along these lines more likely. In 1966, the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords issued a practice statement saying that it would no longer consider itself bound by its own previous decisions as it had so held since 1898. This would allow that court, in theory, to depart from its own decisions in favour of contrary decisions from other Commonwealth courts. Second, also in 1966, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council decided that the High Court of Australia was free to depart within broad limits from decisions of the House of Lords without the Judicial Committee automatically allowing an appeal because the High Court had so acted. Academics enthused over the possibilities for a wider, harmonised body of Commonwealth law, none more so than the young English John Latham Chair of Law at Monash University, David Jackson. The claim was relatively minimalist, that legal issues should be decided in the light of, rather than in ignorance of, decisions already taken in other common law jurisdictions. The article, published in the Cambridge Law Journal, was directed primarily at English lawyers who, in Jackson's view, adopted a largely myopic view of the common law, that it was English law. Now that the Judicial Committee had decided that there could be more than one version of substantive common law rules applicable depending on context, English courts should, as Commonwealth courts routinely did, survey a wider range of cases from Commonwealth jurisdictions in determining what the law should be in England. At one level of generality, Jackson's argument was ultimately reflected in practice. Courts of the Commonwealth can and do frequently look at decisions in other Commonwealth courts when seeking to answer a difficult legal problem of their own. I doubt, however, that a modern Australian court would link this practice to some form of subliminal British race patriotism, which was the basis of Windea's claim, and also of the arguments for unity made at the Commonwealth and Empire law conferences of the 1960s. At least two factors operated to make that basis harder to justify than it might have been. First, while Windea in his article made reference to considering Commonwealth cases, not all Commonwealth cases were equal. The first port of call was English cases, followed closely by New Zealand cases, to which the High Court was readily attentive. Next was other common law cases, undefined, and then sometimes to Canadian cases and often to the United States cases. This showed both that the common law went beyond the Commonwealth and also that the sources consulted were largely from the former settler colonies. Windea was a man of his times and no doubt did not see the irony in hoping that the newly independent multiracial countries might see Australia as a model to follow. He was not alone. The language of the papers and reports in the Commonwealth and Empire law conferences in Canada and Sydney was redolent of a legal hierarchy based de facto on race, perpetuated by some of the judiciary from the newly independent nations. This was not a judicial commonwealth that was likely to appeal in the long run. At the other end of the spectrum, the thrust of Jackson's article was that it was English courts that would have to change practice. It's true that the 1960s saw a greater engagement with, especially Australian cases. Engagement, however, was not the same as persuasion, and superior English courts were slow to be persuaded. When the legal issue that prompted the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council to allow Australian law to diverge from English law, a case involving Australian politician Tom Uren and the awarding of exemplary damages in libel, when this subsequently came before the House of Lords in 1971, there was much expectation that their lordships would overrule their own prior decision and follow the High Court. By a majority, they declined to do so, citing the Australian case law with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Other decisions in England were more positive, but at no time in this period did the House of Lords recant from a decision of their own in favour of Commonwealth authority. But if a judicial commonwealth was to mean anything, it needed the former judicial pinnacle of the old empire, in practice the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords rather than the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, to show its commitment to the new regime by actions as well as words. Perhaps a judicial commonwealth built on reverence for a British common law could never have lasted, given the wider pressures on the Commonwealth over time. But the failure of the House of Lords to overtly adopt it as a model meant it never had the chance. Whatever faith Windeyer might have had in his version of a judicial commonwealth in the mid-1960s, it had evaporated a decade later. In the Commonwealth Lecture of 1977, which is formerly the Smuts Lecture, a rather wistful and somewhat melancholic Windeyer reflected on Australia in the Commonwealth. Towards the end of his lecture, he observed, Australians today cherish sentiments that are a heritage from the days of empire. The allegiance to the Queen is because she is Queen of Great Britain and Queen of Australia, not because she is head of the Commonwealth, which means little or nothing in Australia. I suspect Menzies would have agreed. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Very delighted to be here to speak to you all today for my topic of Equally Sacred Precincts, as I've titled it, why Lords was as central to Westminster, to Menzies' relationship with the British Commonwealth of Nations. I think it's a very great segue from Mark's talk, how law is so involved in concepts of cricket and certainly British race patriotism as a theme I won't be speaking about in my talk, but certainly an undertone of the material I'm getting through today. But I've decided to name the talk Equally Sacred Precincts as a reference to this quote from a letter that Menzies writes to his brother in 1938 saying, "I have now completed an admirable double, speaking with Baldwin on high matters of state in Westminster Hall and speaking with him on cricket in the almost equally sacred precincts of Lords." Now, it's a great quote, and I bring it not necessarily to pit Lords against Westminster. I'm not really trying to speak too much to Lords itself, but as a representation of cricket itself, and how in this context there is an equivalence for Menzies between cricket as there is politics. And I think too often in an academic context, while everyone loves cricket, is often taken not too seriously, often treated as insignificant, as trivial, as peripheral. But really what I hope to demonstrate in today's talk is how central cricket was to Menzies' conception of Britishness and to Menzies' conception of the British Commonwealth of Nations. Politically, emotionally, culturally, I believe that cricket really sits at the heart of this vision for Menzies, and without really scrutinising it, you don't really get the full picture. And I think it's interesting, Alex spoke yesterday that he considered Baldwin to be the greatest Englishman he'd ever met, and maybe it's because he scaled the heights of being both Prime Minister in Westminster and also President of the MCC at Lords. And while I can argue for the centrality of cricket in Menzies' life, Menzies also argues for the centrality of cricket in his life, as he says at Lords in 1968, "Cricket occupies a place in the world and a place in my mind that nothing else can occupy, not even the noble pursuit of politics." And so I want to start, I think for my talk, just to outline it briefly, I have sort of 3 points to address. The first really is setting up from an academic perspective the connection between cricket and ideas of Britishness. Secondly, to then establish Menzies' idea of cricket as within his conception of Britishness. And thirdly, to bring a case study of the rather peculiar connection he has with a small English club called East Molesey that I think is very revealing towards Menzies' attitude to a rapidly changing Commonwealth and to an empire that is breaking down around him. And so I start today by talking about cricket and the ways in which it was really elevated culturally in Victorian England. Once upon a time, cricket was just a game, but in Victorian England, it was really elevated to this high ideal. And the academic Keith Sanderford writes a lot about cricket in Victorian England, and he says, "Cricket became a powerful symbolic and representational force for Victorians who believed that it embodied all that was noble in the Anglo-Saxon character. Victorians began glorifying the game as a perfect system of manners, ethics, and morals. Cricket became synonymous with exemplary moral behaviour. Cricket language became a moral code. Indeed, the Victorians came to see cricket as the perfect medium through which a good deal could be learnt about ethics, morals, justice, religion, and life itself. And therefore, cricket was elevated to this high plane and it exemplified the high values of British society, but it also nurtured them. It nurtured concepts of British justice. It nurtured notions of fair play, of sportsmanship, even of democracy. And so much so that it nurtured these qualities that it was really treated as an institution, and of institutional importance, that of the other key institutions upholding the English way of life, that is the Crown, that is the Church, and that is Parliament. And they sat together as these key institutions upholding the British way of life. And also it was raised from a cultural level. It was given so much cultural value, to the point, as Sandiford writes, that cricket was as important in a socio-cultural sense as literature, as music, and the arts. One of the, exemplars of this heightened state of cricket in Victorian England is the fact that when it was codified not with rules, but with laws. And it's a very interesting distinction which speaks to the gentlemanly nature of Victorian cricket. And also, on top of the fact that it was codified with laws, it's underwritten by an ethical code that we colloquially know as the spirit of cricket, which together, as Anthony Bateman writes, presents cricket and the codification of it as a pre-existing natural phenomenon that's simply been codified. And this speaks to a really important myth that sits at the heart of cricket in Victorian England, and that is the myth of the village green. And as Mark Marquesi writes, this is the myth at cricket's heart, the myth of the village green. That paradise, purportedly the fons et origo of English cricket, bastion of its abiding values, source and mainstay of cricket's unique Englishness. And so this enduring cultural mythology of cricket residing in the English green, sort of promoted by so many literary evocations of the game in the English countryside, not only positions cricket as emblematic of the British tradition, but also of the British people. And the idea that cricket grows from almost the soil of England is very important when understanding the ways in which cricket was conceived in the British identity. And I think, as Bateman writes, that is predicated on the belief that the mythical notion of Anglo-Saxon racial purity resided in the English countryside. And to speak to the confluence of these factors of cricket and the village green, so much so today that if any of you, which I'm sure many of you will be watching the Ashes this summer, you'll see that every morning the English team is invited onto the ground with the Barmy Army singing the hymn Jerusalem, which speaks of, walking upon England's mountain green, on England pleasant's pastures seen in England's green and pleasant land. And so this mythology really lives at the heart of cricket up until this day. And finally, sort of on the more theoretical side of it, because of cricket's Britishness, how it was treated as, the quintessential English game, it became a really powerful tool for spreading Britishness throughout the empire. And not just from the fact that through the playing of cricket, people were inculcated in the British tradition, but also in replicating the physical environment in foreign fields. And so this really brings me to Menzies and the fact that Menzies was born within this context. He was born in 1894 in a period which scholars regard as the golden age of cricket, between 1819 and 1914, and the golden age, not because it was a period of necessarily higher skill or higher drama, but because it was the most beautiful embodiment of these values of cricket in the ways in which it is understood in Victorian England. And not only was Menzies born into this world, but he was very much taught about this world. And I've got on the left Victor Trumper, who many of you might recognise, but on the right, I think, is the headmaster that he had at Wesley, Lawrence Adamson, who was very much pedagogically schooled in the tradition of how cricket and sport more generally was an essential component in raising good young empire men. And in order for them to carry on the British tradition, they had to pursue their intellectual pursuits, but also cricket as well became very important in that. And that, before I move on, I also maybe sheds a bit of light on the story that John Bunting brings. It's a very humorous story in his portrait of Menzies, of a young Menzies at Wesley walking up and down the cricket nets, reading a copy of Shakespeare. And it's a very humorous anecdote, one, because it shows that Menzies really should have been playing cricket in the cricket nets rather than reading Shakespeare. And I think for many it would seem a very jarring juxtaposition. But given the institutional nature of cricket and how central it was to Britishness, and how elevated it was as a cultural practice, you could really argue where else would it be better to read Shakespeare than walking up and down a cricket net. And so, speaking of some of this tradition, just as an example of how Menzies affirms this tradition, is in his Wisden article. He says, "Cricket is the mother of great traditions. It dwells in the eye and in the blood. Tom Brown was right when he said at his last school match, it's more than a game, it's an institution. And like all great institutions which are part of our inheritance, it gets into the blood. Now, I probably could spend the next 15 minutes talking about just Menzies' quotes on cricket because there are so many. But thankfully, he's also very repetitive in his themes and those themes shine through very clearly in all his written material on cricket and his, after-dinner speeches. And just to pick up on a few of them, he many times referenced cricket as an art. This is his favourite photograph of Keith Miller, which he compares to a Greek sculpture. And he says, it produces a million things of beauty for the eye. It is not only a game, it is a fine art. And so because I love art, I love cricket. So this theme of cricket as a great art comes up all the time for Menzies, as does his conception that cricket is a great creator of character. Cricket not only a game of skill, he says, but of character. Cricket produces character. And he says, I've never met a celebrated cricketer in my life who didn't appeal to me as a decent chap that I would like to take out for dinner. And as mentioned yesterday, I think in Josh's talk and also in Alex's talk, he's so enamoured, Menzies, by the green fields of England. It's something that he has learnt from all these literary equivocations in the first 41 years of his life, and then he finally sees it. And he speaks very often and warmly and glowingly of the green fields of the great game of cricket. His very famous quote, Cathedral of Cricket, I think gets much more context within this. Why I was so well loved, that idea of the Cathedral of Cricket, because cricket was so central, was so sacred, and so central to notions of church and queen in England. But this takes me on to my case study. Now, Menzies has so many cricketing connections, and going through his papers, I'm still very overwhelmed by the amount of time he had for cricket. He had so many cricketing friends, and he had so many cricket connections, particularly in the UK. He was obviously associated with the MCC, becoming a life member, and adjacent clubs like Isingari and the Lord's Taverners, which he was president. He was also president of the 40 Club in England, and he was president later during his time as Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports at Kent County Cricket Club. But the one that really jumped out of the research for me was his connection with a small English club in the countryside in Surrey called East Molesey Cricket Club. Now, you might be asking very appropriately, well, what is East Molesey Cricket Club, or who is East Molesey Club? And here I've got this painting, and as I read an extract from Spencer Lemming, he says, in the long room of the pavilion at Cricket's Holy of Holies, Lord's Cricket Ground, London, is an oil painting by Richard Wilson, RA, showing cricket as it was first played in 1695 at Moleseyhurst, a green pleasaunce on the banks of the Thames and within a stone's throw of Hampton Court. So East Molesey, then termed Moleseyhurst and now East Molesey, is in the context of cricket a very ancient club, and whose at this point was referred to starting in 1695. I think that's since been pushed a little later, but as East Molesey publishes of itself, and I'll ask you to excuse the misogynist language in this, but they say, unlike the average woman, a cricket club does not object to divulging its age. Indeed, when a club has as long a history as East Molesey, it rightly prides itself on the date of its birth. Alas, it's not possible to give the exact year that the East Molesey Club was formed, but that it is one of the oldest clubs is beyond dispute, and cricket has been played on or very near the present ground for over 250 years. Now, historically speaking, there have been scholars that have gone back and tried to identify the exact moment that the cricket was born. And the earliest report happens, I think, in 1723, a match between the gentlemen of Surrey versus the gentlemen of London, and a match that is presided by Frederick, Prince of Wales, who, by living in Hampton Court, becomes very associated with the cricket club. And a lot of the early reports of cricket around the early 1700s show Frederick, Prince of Wales, to be very connected to the club. There are two elements or quirks about the club that make it extra famous beyond its fact that it is incredibly old, one of which is that the first recorded case of the LBW decision happens at East Molesey, and that's quite a badge of honour for the club. And secondly, there is the mythical legend of Tags Island, an island that sits across the Thames from the ground, and there is this ongoing challenge about who can hit the ball 140 yards onto Tags Island, and no one has been able to do it, not even the great W.G. Grace, who played at East Molesey, of course. And it almost has this mythical sort of King Arthur, Excalibur type mythology. Whoever can hit the ball on Tags Island will be king. And so, as it has this rich, ancient history, sitting on the banks of the Thames with Hampton Court, the royal residence, looking over the ground with a church in the background, in many ways, East Molesey represents the ultimate depiction mythology of the village green, which leads writers to say, this is East Molesey, proud citadel of England's ancient sport, or that ancient mecca of cricketers. There is something essentially English about East Molesey Cricket Club, a newspaper writes. and another calls it real village green cricket in a sylvan setting. And this one, which gets pretty funny, East Molesey ground, standing as it does on the banks of the greatest river in the world, near the greatest city in the world, the capital of the greatest empire in the world. And so East Molesey is really viewed, as I said before, in this as an ultimate in many ways of the iconography of English cricket. And now you might be asking, what does this have to do with Menzies? How does Menzies become involved with the cricket club so far away? And the answer is this guy. Unfortunately, the slide looks very terrible, but you can see the man on the screen is Basil Montrose Turner. Now, Basil Turner is, in a sense, a figure lost to history in some ways, and I say that in that there is, as far as I can tell, no reference to him in any secondary literature. I've only found out, I still don't know when he was born or when he dies, but he certainly comes through in the literature, primary research of East Molesey Cricket Club. And born in New Zealand, Basil Turner is very much a man of empire. He, in his professional life, is founding director and controller of the Reciprocal Trades Federation of the United Kingdom, which is an organisation that helps with the ideal of spreading empire trade. He's considered an authority on empire trade. And he really lives this empire experience. And with that value of spreading empire through trade, he also believes in the value of spreading empire through cricket. And he becomes associated with the East Molesey Club as their vice president in 37 and their president in 47. And he's very much a talismanic figure, an inspirational leader in transforming the image, drawing on the rich history of the club in order to promote it to the world. And it says of Mr. Turner's policy is to make East Molesey Club a truly empire one. His belief being that ties of empire can be drawn closer through cricket. And it is at Molesey, he says, where we try to preserve the real traditions of cricket. So clearly it's steeped in the language of empire, and he has such high ideals for the view of the club. And I wanted to bring a quote which speaks to the anxieties of a post-war British Empire, which is rapidly changing. And there is so much anxieties, not just from the war, where the British tradition and the British life was under threat, but also going forward with, decolonisation and also the impending Cold War. And Turner says at one of these luncheons at a festival match played at East Molesey in 1950, he says, "England has suffered much, but with all preserved proportion and balance, which finds its best expression in events such as this day. May the fates ordain that come what will from all world's isms, Englishmen and the Empire's sons for 1,000 years shall be able to assemble on this spot to argue whether the first LBW decision born on this ground was for the good of the game or whether a ball had yet reached Tagg's Island. My lords and gentlemen guests, thank you very much for the great compliment you pay us by honouring us with your company. May these few unhurried hours at East Molesey help to lighten your cares, conduce to the better ordering of your onerous duties, and assist you to bring about in the minds of all men ideas of good and tolerant government akin to the true spirit of cricket." This is sort of a very amazing value statement that just shows how through cricket there is this bastion of hope almost of preserving these English traditions in a rapidly changing global environment. And so through his extensive connections, Basil Turner, without empire, he starts not only to promote his trade ideas, but also that of his cricket club. And in his wish to make the club a club of empire, he starts bringing in so many dignitaries who are wooed by this image of this ancient club, not just cabinet ministers in the UK, the Duke of Edinburgh, prime ministers and high commissioners in New Zealand, but also I've got here Herbert Cole-Coombs, Eric Harrison, and of course, Sir Robert Menzies as Prime Minister. And he is wooed by this image that Turner gives to him of the painting I showed earlier, showing cricket being played in Molesey. And Menzies says, "It will have a place of honour in my study at the Lodge." And soon Menzies, wooed by this image, becomes a Vice President of East Molesey. And to finish, I want to talk about 3 examples of his connection with East Molesey, and I'll try and be as quick as possible, that demonstrate his commitment to the vision that Turner sets forward for East Molesey and of empire. And the first is a proposal put forward to the Cabinet by Eric Harrison of helping East Molesey become a club of empire, and that is the decision to donate Australian timbers toward the building of the new East Molesey Pavilion. So in a press conference on the 23rd of April 1953, it says, "The Prime Minister, Mr. Robert Menzies, said the gift would symbolise the closeness existing between the dominions in the field of sport. Its aim was to have the new pavilion panelled with empire wood. To which he says, Menzies, I feel sure all Australian cricket lovers will endorse the federal government's desire to be associated with the East Molesey Cricket Club in its plans for improving its ancient ground. And I've found here in the budget, which it might, oh yes, you can see, of 1954-55, £265, which according to the Reserve Bank's inflation calculator works out to about over $11,000, which obviously in relation to a budget is small but significant. Amazing to have not just Menzies' desire to be associated, but a federal government desire to be associated with the ideals of this club. And I'm not sure how such a thing would be received today, but certainly might have gone under the radar at the time. And as a result of this, and the club are obviously very thankful for this amazing development, they decide to name a pair of wrought iron gates that have been gifted to the club, the Menzies Gates, as a symbol of the close association between the government and the people of Australia and the East Molesey Cricket Club, and in particular with that distinguished statesman, R.G. Menzies. And so there is this amazing ceremony, two ceremonies that happened in the unveiling of the gates, one in East Molesey and one 12,000 miles away in Australia, where there is a dedication to the Menzies Gates, sitting underneath, I must add, the British flag, not the Australian flag that it is unveiled underneath. And the rhetoric that is applied throughout the speeches, whether it be from the Reverend, who says that founded here is all that is best of our traditions, that we appreciate that anyone who comes through this wrought iron portal will appreciate that here is part of all that is best in the English way of life. We as the mother country are proud of our sons. And Lord Leathers, who is a former cabinet minister, speaks glowingly of the connections between the club, and the same with one of the agents general. And then 12,000 miles away in Australia is a ceremony at Government House held by the Governor Sir Dallas Brooks, of course himself, a Vice President of East Molesey Cricket Club, presenting to Menzies a life membership medallion. And it says here, Government House like Test Ground. And I think it's a funny headline, but also very emblematic of the symbolism of how in Test cricket and in government there is so much overlap and similarity. And finally, Menzies is then invited at 1955 to open or to lay the foundation stone for the new pavilion, which there are some lovely photos of, in which she says, this place, for all well-constituted people like ourselves and hundreds of millions of others, is one of the historic places of our race. And therefore I lay this stone in that commemorative sense. And that line, historic place of our race, is so revealing in terms of not just the British tradition, but also the British race as such a factor for Menzies in understanding his vision of empire. And he says, and I also laid, as you can see, as a foundation stone of a new pavilion which will perpetuate this place so that it will be, for centuries to come, an historic spot for all cricket lovers. It's another photo of him with Pelham Warner in the middle, considered sort of they say that he is English cricket, and Basil Turner, that's the luncheon, which looks very disfigured. And here is Menzies, I guess, speaking at the luncheon, which are some great photos. And the East Molesey story goes on that they open the pavilion. Menzies again returns in 1956, has presented this plaque, which I can speak to another time. But I better wrap it up there in saying that through this example, which is but one of many for Menzies, I think it is very revealing in that Menzies sees in this vision of the village green the best of the English tradition, the best of the English way of life, and I think says much about his attitude to a changing Commonwealth. And I hope in this piece I've proved not only how central Lords was to Westminster, but maybe even more so the village green sat at the heart of Menzies' conception of the British Commonwealth of Nations. Anyway, I better wrap it up there, but thanks so much.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.